The story of the Habsburgs begins not in grand palaces, nor on vast battlefields, but in a small, unremarkable castle in what is today Switzerland. This castle, Habsburg Castle, perched on a hill overlooking the Aare River, was home to a minor noble family with little wealth or influence. But what they lacked in riches, they made up for in patience, strategy, and an unshakable ambition to rise above their station. Imagine the cold stones of that castle, the families who lived there quietly plotting marriages, alliances, and strategies that would one day place them at the heart of Europe. This is where the seeds of one of history's most powerful dynasties were planted. The first notable figure in the family was Radbot of Habsburg, a man who lived in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. He constructed the Habsburg Castle around 1020, establishing the family's name and giving them a base from which they could expand their influence. Radbot may not have known that centuries later, his descendants would rule over territories stretching from Spain to the edge of Eastern Europe. But even at this early stage, the family began to master the art of forging alliances through marriage, a strategy that would become their greatest weapon. Every union was carefully calculated, not just for love or convenience, but as a way to gain land, wealth, and influence. By the 13th century, the Habsburgs had started to expand their influence far beyond their original home. They acquired lands in what is now Austria, gradually increasing their power and wealth. The turning point came with Rudolf I, who in 1273 became King of Germany. This was no small achievement. At the time, Germany was not a unified nation, but a patchwork of duchies, principalities, and free cities, each ruled by powerful local lords. For a man from a modest family to ascend to the kingship was extraordinary. Rudolf's election was aided by both political skill and the support of powerful allies, and it marked the beginning of the Habsburgs' rise to Central European dominance. But Rudolf's rise was not without conflict. Germany at that time was filled with rival nobles who were wary of any family gaining too much power. Many lords viewed Rudolf as an outsider, a man with humble beginnings who dared to claim authority over them. To secure his position, he needed to act decisively. He focused on consolidating his power, winning the loyalty of smaller lords, and strategically marrying his children into other noble families. Every marriage strengthened the Habsburg network, creating alliances that would serve as a foundation for centuries of influence. By the end of the 13th century, the Habsburgs had begun to expand into Austria, a region that would become the heart of their empire for centuries. Through a combination of diplomacy, inheritance, and occasional military action, they acquired key territories and established a stronghold that would endure for generations. The acquisition of Austria was a masterstroke. It placed the Habsburgs in a strategic location at the center of Europe, giving them access to trade routes, political power, and the ability to influence neighboring regions. At this point, a family that once lived quietly in a Swiss castle had begun to command respect across the continent. But power, as history often shows, attracts both allies and enemies. As the Habsburgs grew stronger, other noble families began to see them as rivals. This tension often erupted into wars, alliances broken and remade, and constant maneuvering for influence. One of the most famous early Habsburg strategies was a careful marriage of Rudolf I's descendants. By marrying into powerful families, they not only gained lands and titles, but also ensured that their bloodline would intertwine with the rulers of Europe. This strategy would later be famously summed up in the phrase, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." It was a strategy of patience, diplomacy, and vision, relying on careful planning rather than reckless battles. By the 14th century, the Habsburgs had firmly established their rule in Austria and surrounding regions. The family split into different branches, each governing different territories, but always maintaining loyalty to the larger Habsburg network. This network allowed them to consolidate power while avoiding complete centralization, a system that would serve them well in the centuries to come. They also began to play a significant role in the broader politics of Europe. They were no longer just regional rulers. They were emerging as a force that could influence kings, popes, and emperors. The Habsburgs' rise was marked by both brilliance and patience. Unlike many noble families that sought immediate conquest, they often moved slowly, building alliances and securing their position over decades. This long-term vision was crucial. In an era where many powerful families rose and fell within a single generation, the Habsburgs understood the value of stability. They invested in education, administration, and culture, ensuring that their territories were not only ruled but also respected. Every palace, monastery, and city they influenced became part of a wider strategy to consolidate power and prestige. Yet, despite their growing power, challenges were constant. Europe in the Middle Ages was a dangerous place, full of wars, rebellions, and shifting loyalties. The Habsburgs had to navigate a complex web of rival families, rebellious nobles, and foreign powers. Sometimes, this meant engaging in battle. Other times, it meant negotiating marriages or treaties. Their ability to adapt to changing circumstances became one of their defining strengths. They were patient, strategic, and often willing to endure short-term setbacks for long-term gains. A particularly striking example of this strategy can be seen in the marriages arranged during the 14th and 15th centuries. The Habsburgs married into families across Europe, from Bohemia to Hungary, from Spain to Burgundy. Each marriage was a calculated move, expanding influence without the need for war. By the end of the 15th century, the Habsburg network of alliances had become vast and powerful, giving the family an unprecedented position in European politics. Even as they rose, the Habsburgs faced internal challenges. Rival branches of the family sometimes clashed over territory or influence. Managing these conflicts required careful diplomacy, as a single internal dispute could weaken the family's overall power. The Habsburgs learned to balance ambition with restraint, understanding that unity was essential for survival. They also cultivated relationships with the church, recognizing that religious authority could lend legitimacy to their rule. By aligning with the Pope and other influential religious figures, they strengthened their position and deterred potential challengers. The story of the Habsburg rise is not only one of power and strategy, but also of vision. From a small castle in Switzerland to the kingship of Germany and the rule of Austria, the Habsburgs demonstrated that patience, planning, and careful alliances could achieve what brute force alone could not. Their rise was slow but steady, marked by moments of brilliance and careful calculation. They were never the fastest or the strongest, but they were among the most strategic and enduring families in European history. And just when it seemed their rise might plateau, the Habsburgs were about to embark on a chapter that would secure their place in history forever. A new era was coming, one where the ambitions of one family would stretch across continents, involve kings and emperors, and shape the future of Europe in ways no one could have imagined. But even as they reached new heights, challenges were lurking just beyond the horizon. Challenges that would test the limits of their strategy, patience, and power. This is where the story truly begins to transform. From humble beginnings to the cusp of empire, the Habsburgs were poised to change the face of Europe forever. But power is never without risk. The very strategies that built their empire would later sow the seeds of challenges that could threaten everything they had achieved. And how did a family that started in a quiet Swiss castle come to control an empire that spanned nations? What risks and decisions would define their dominance? And what vulnerabilities would eventually appear in their golden fortress? The answers lie in the next chapter of their story, where ambition meets opportunity, and history begins to bend in favor of the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs had risen from a small castle in Switzerland to dominate Austria, but the real test of their power was still ahead. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the family had begun to stretch its influence across Europe. At the center of this transformation was a remarkable figure, Maximilian I. He inherited a modest realm, but possessed a vision far greater than the lands he controlled. Maximilian understood that armies and battles could win territories, but alliances and marriages could secure an empire that no war alone could hold. Maximilian's strategy was simple in theory, but revolutionary in execution. Instead of relying solely on force, he sought to expand Habsburg influence through marriages. Every union was a carefully planned move on a European chessboard. He married Mary of Burgundy, a union that brought the wealthy and strategically important Burgundian lands into Habsburg control. This marriage was not just a personal union. It represented the merging of resources, armies, and trade networks. The Habsburgs were no longer just rulers of Austria. They were becoming rulers of lands stretching from the North Sea to the Alps. Maximilian also focused on diplomacy and bureaucracy. He strengthened his administration, ensuring that his territories were not only controlled but efficiently governed. Local rulers were often left with authority over day-to-day affairs, but they answered to the Habsburgs, creating a system of loyalty and influence. His careful attention to law, governance, and diplomacy ensured that the family's expansion was sustainable. Unlike many rulers who relied on conquest alone, Maximilian built a foundation that would support centuries of Habsburg rule. Perhaps the most famous example of the Habsburg strategy of marriage came with Maximilian's grandson, Charles V. Charles inherited a staggering set of territories from both his father and mother, creating one of the largest empires in European history. From the Spanish kingdoms to the Low Countries, from Austria to parts of Italy and the Americas, Charles ruled an empire so vast that it was said the sun never set on his lands. Imagine a man standing at the center of Europe, responsible for territories that stretched across oceans, speaking multiple languages, and dealing with rulers, nobles, and church leaders in dozens of regions. This was the power of the Habsburgs at their height. Charles V's reign, however, was far from easy. Controlling such a vast empire meant constant challenges. In Spain, he faced tensions between the local nobility and his appointed governors. In the Holy Roman Empire, the princes jealously guarded their autonomy, resisting central authority whenever possible. Meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation was spreading across Europe, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church and threatening the unity of his empire. Charles had to navigate wars, rebellions, and religious upheaval simultaneously, testing both his skill and the resilience of the Habsburg system. One of the remarkable aspects of Habsburg rule during this period was their ability to maintain control despite such complexity. They relied heavily on family networks, placing relatives in key positions of power across Europe. This system ensured loyalty and created a web of influence that extended far beyond any single territory. For example, while Charles ruled the Spanish and Austrian lands, his brother Ferdinand was placed as a ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, ensuring that Habsburg influence remained strong in Central Europe. The Habsburgs also became patrons of the arts and culture, using wealth and prestige to strengthen their image. Palaces, churches, and public works were built across their territories, reflecting their power and sophistication. Cities like Vienna and Prague flourished under Habsburg rule, attracting artists, architects, and scholars. This cultural investment was more than vanity. It was a deliberate strategy to display authority and consolidate loyalty among the people. The message was clear. The Habsburgs were not only rulers, but the center of European civilization and power. Yet, even as they reached the height of their power, cracks were beginning to appear. The Habsburg strategy of marrying into power came with risks. With so many unions across different countries, the family became increasingly entangled in foreign conflicts. Their inheritances often led to disputes, and their commitment to multiple territories made them vulnerable to rebellion or invasion. Controlling such a vast empire required constant attention, and even the most careful planning could not eliminate the dangers of politics, war, and religion. The religious conflicts of the 16th century were particularly challenging. The Protestant Reformation, led by figures like Martin Luther, divided Europe. Some regions embraced Protestantism, rejecting the authority of the Catholic Church, while others remained loyal. As defenders of the Church, the Habsburgs were forced to confront these divisions directly. Charles V waged wars against Protestant princes in Germany, hoping to maintain unity and religious authority. However, these conflicts were exhausting and costly, highlighting a growing problem. The Habsburgs were stretched too thin. They ruled too many lands with too many challenges, and even their careful strategy could not fully control every region. Despite these challenges, the Habsburgs continued to expand. Through strategic marriages, Charles V inherited the Spanish Empire, including vast territories in the Americas. Suddenly, the Habsburgs were rulers not only in Europe but across the Atlantic, with colonies in South America, Central America, and parts of North America. The wealth in the Americas funded armies, palaces, and political ambitions, allowing the Habsburgs to maintain dominance for decades. Even at the peak of their power, the Habsburgs faced constant threats. France, the Ottoman Empire, and internal rivals all challenged their authority. Wars in Italy, the Low Countries, and Eastern Europe tested their military strength. Diplomacy was often as important as war, with treaties, alliances, and marriages acting as tools to maintain balance. Charles V, despite his extraordinary empire, eventually chose to abdicate, realizing that ruling such a vast domain was nearly impossible for one person. He divided his empire between his son, Philip II, and his brother, Ferdinand, creating a system that would define Habsburg rule for generations. This division marked both a triumph and a challenge. On one hand, the Habsburgs had created a global empire, unmatched in history. On the other, splitting the territories introduced new complications. Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire now required separate governance, coordination, and attention. While the family maintained influence, the sheer scale of their holdings made unity difficult. It was a moment that demonstrated both the brilliance and the limitations of the Habsburg strategy. Philip II, who inherited Spain, became one of the most famous Habsburg rulers. He controlled territories in Europe, the Americas, and Asia, making him a global monarch. His reign was marked by both victories and struggles. He faced wars against England and the Netherlands, religious conflicts at home and abroad, and the challenges of governing distant lands. Philip's efforts to maintain Habsburg dominance were heroic, but also revealed the vulnerabilities of an empire so vast and interconnected. Every decision had consequences, and every war strained the resources of his kingdom. Meanwhile, the Austrian Habsburgs under Ferdinand worked to maintain control in Central Europe. They dealt with rebellious princes, Ottoman invasions, and the delicate politics of the Holy Roman Empire. Through it all, the family relied on its strategy of alliances, diplomacy, and careful governance. They cultivated loyalty, strengthened borders, and maintained influence over a complex and divided Europe. The Habsburgs had become masters of survival, as well as power, using patience, strategy, and family connections to endure challenges that might have destroyed other dynasties. Yet, as they reached the height of their power, the seeds of future decline were already present. Their commitment to maintaining a vast network of territories created constant tension. Wars, rebellions, and economic strain tested their ability to govern. Religious divisions threatened to weaken loyalty, and the reliance on marriage alliances, while initially successful, meant that the family was deeply entangled in the politics of distant lands, sometimes to their detriment. The very strategy that built the empire also created vulnerabilities that would later challenge the Habsburgs in dramatic ways. The story of the Habsburgs at their peak is one of brilliance, ambition, and careful strategy. From a small castle in Switzerland to a global empire, they demonstrated that patience, planning, and alliances could achieve extraordinary power. But their story also reveals a cautionary tale. Power that spans continents is difficult to manage, and even the most skilled rulers must confront limits. The Habsburgs were unmatched in vision, yet their vast empire would one day face pressures that even they could not fully control. How could a family that seemed unstoppable, ruling the largest empire in the world, face challenges so severe that it would eventually falter? What mistakes, misfortunes, or unavoidable forces would transform the Habsburg strength into vulnerability? The answers lie in the next part of the story, where wars, succession crises, and changing Europe would test the dynasty to its limits, leading to its eventual decline. At the peak of their power, the Habsburgs seemed invincible. They ruled territories that stretched across Europe and the Americas. Their wealth, armies, and strategic marriages had placed them at the center of global politics. Yet, history has a way of testing even the greatest empires. The very strategies that built the Habsburg Dynasty, vast territories, intermarriages, and reliance on alliances, would eventually sow the seeds of vulnerability. The decline of the Habsburgs was not sudden. It was a slow, complex process shaped by wars, weak rulers, internal divisions, and the changing political and social landscape of Europe. One of the first challenges came with the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs. Philip II had ruled a vast empire, but after his death, his successors struggled to maintain it. Philip III and Philip IV faced economic crises, inflation, and revolts in the Netherlands. Maintaining overseas colonies in the Americas and Asia required enormous resources, and the revenues often fell short of the cost of defending them. Wars with France, England, and the Dutch Republic drained the treasury and weakened the state. The Spanish Habsburgs became trapped by the very empire that had once made them powerful. Their vast holdings were both a source of prestige and a burden that stretched their abilities too thin. The problem was compounded by the issue of succession. The Habsburgs, famous for their intermarriages, often married close relatives to maintain power within the family. While this strategy had expanded their influence, it created a serious problem: inbreeding. Genetic disorders became increasingly common, leading to rulers who were physically weak, mentally unstable, or infertile. One of the most infamous examples was Charles II of Spain, the last Spanish Habsburg. Born after generations of intermarriage, he suffered from severe physical and mental disabilities and was unable to produce an heir. His death in 1700 triggered a European crisis known as the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would reshape the continent and expose the fragility of the Habsburg legacy. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, the Austrian Habsburgs faced their own challenges. The Holy Roman Empire, once a source of Habsburg power, had become fragmented. Princes and electors increasingly resisted central authority, and religious conflicts continued to divide the empire. The 30 Years' War, which began in 1618, was a devastating conflict that involved much of Europe, but had its roots in the struggles of the Habsburgs to maintain control over their territories. Ferdinand II and his successors fought fiercely to defend Catholicism and central authority, but the war devastated the population, ruined economies, and weakened Habsburg power. By the war's end in 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia had established limits on the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor, further eroding the Habsburgs' influence. Economic challenges also played a critical role in the decline. Maintaining vast empires required immense wealth, yet the Habsburgs struggled to manage resources efficiently. Wars drained treasuries, agricultural production was often disrupted by conflict, and taxation created resentment among subjects. Spain, in particular, faced a severe economic decline during the 17th century. Despite vast wealth from colonies, mismanagement, corruption, and costly military campaigns weakened the state. Austria faced similar difficulties, relying on a patchwork of lands with different laws, languages, and local authorities. The empire was diverse but difficult to govern, making centralized reforms nearly impossible. Another factor in the decline was military pressure from external powers. France, under Louis XIV, emerged as a dominant force in Europe and frequently challenged Habsburg influence. The Ottoman Empire continued to threaten southeastern Europe, forcing Austria to defend its borders repeatedly. Prussia and Russia also rose as powerful states in the 17th and 18th centuries, challenging the balance of power that the Habsburgs had once controlled. The dynasty that had once seemed untouchable found itself surrounded by ambitious rivals who were faster, more centralized, and increasingly capable of waging modern warfare. Internal divisions further weakened the dynasty. The Habsburgs ruled a multi-ethnic empire that included Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, Croats, and many other peoples. Managing such diversity was always challenging, but became more difficult as nationalism began to emerge in the 18th and 19th centuries. Different groups within the empire resisted central authority, demanded autonomy, and sometimes rebelled outright. The Habsburg rulers struggled to maintain loyalty while balancing the demands of each group. This problem was exacerbated by slow communication, inefficient administration, and entrenched local elites. The empire that had once been united by strategic marriages and careful alliances now faced fragmentation from within. The War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, marked a turning point. With the death of Charles II, European powers feared a Habsburg-Spanish union that would upset the balance of power. The resulting war involved France, England, Austria, and other states, devastating much of Europe. In the end, the Spanish Habsburg line ended, and Philip V of Bourbon became King of Spain. Austria gained some territories in Italy and the Low Countries, but the loss of Spain marked a symbolic and practical blow. The dynasty was no longer the uncontested power it had been under Charles V. It was a reminder that even centuries of careful strategy could not protect against unforeseen crises. The 18th century brought further challenges. Maria Theresa and her son, Joseph II, attempted reforms to strengthen the Austrian Habsburgs. They modernized administration, reformed the economy, and tried to centralize authority. Yet these reforms often met resistance from nobles, local officials, and even the church. Joseph II, in particular, pursued radical changes, including religious reforms and the abolition of serfdom, which created backlash among the population. While these efforts demonstrated vision and courage, they also highlighted the limits of Habsburg power. The dynasty could govern a large empire, but reforming it without causing unrest was nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the rise of Prussia and Russia shifted the balance of power in Central and Eastern Europe. Frederick the Great of Prussia challenged Austria in the War of Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Russia expanded influence into Eastern Europe and the Balkans. The Habsburgs, once the dominant power in these regions, were now forced into competition with states that were more centralized and militarily efficient. The dynasty's reliance on traditional alliances, diplomacy, and slow reforms was no longer enough to maintain supremacy. Europe was changing, and the Habsburgs struggled to adapt. The 19th century brought perhaps the greatest test. Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power, conquering much of Europe and challenging the old dynasties. Austria fought multiple wars against France, suffering defeats and losing territories. The Napoleonic Wars revealed the vulnerabilities of the Habsburg military and administration, forcing the dynasty to confront the need for modernization. After Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna restored Habsburg influence, but the empire was no longer the uncontested power it had been in the 16th century. It was a survivor in a world that had grown more competitive and nationalistic. Nationalism became the ultimate challenge. The Habsburgs ruled a multi-ethnic empire in an era when people increasingly demanded nation-states. Italians, Hungarians, Czechs, and other groups sought independence or autonomy, creating continuous tension. The 1848 revolution shook the empire, forcing the Habsburgs to make concessions and navigate complex politics to survive. The dynasty endured, but the cracks were widening. It became clear that an empire built on marriages, alliances, and diversity was struggling to survive in an age of nationalism and modern statehood. World War I marked the final chapter. By 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the last major Habsburg domain, was a complex and fragile state. Nationalist movements, economic challenges, and political instability weakened it. When the war began, Austria-Hungary fought valiantly, but ultimately could not survive the pressures of modern warfare and internal divisions. In 1918, the empire collapsed, and Emperor Charles I was forced to abdicate. Centuries of Habsburg rule, built on strategy, marriage, and careful planning, came to an end. The dynasty that had shaped Europe for over 600 years was no longer a political force. Yet, the Habsburg legacy endures. Their influence on European politics, culture, and history is undeniable. They built empires, patronized the arts, and shaped diplomacy in ways that are still studied today. The story of their rise and fall offers lessons about power, ambition, and the challenges of ruling diverse and expansive territories. The dynasty shows how patience, strategy, and vision can achieve greatness, but also how external pressures, internal divisions, and the limits of human ability can bring even the greatest empires to their knees. The Habsburg story is a testament to the complexity of history. They were not invincible, yet they endured far longer than most dynasties. They were brilliant strategists, yet vulnerable to human error and the forces of change. And they were rulers of vast territories, yet ultimately unable to contain the growing tides of nationalism, war, and political transformation. The fall of the Habsburgs reminds us that empires, no matter how powerful, are always temporary. They rise, flourish, and eventually give way to the new realities of history. Their rise and fall is not just a story of kings and battles. It is a lesson about the limits of human ambition, the fragility of power, and the inevitability of transformation in history. What other empires might one day face the same fate? And what can we learn from the dynasty that once ruled the heart of Europe for centuries?